Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Shreya Bhandari, who is professor and the director of the social work program here at Purdue Northwest. She earned her Ph.D. at the University of Missouri and her master's at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, India. Her recent book, which we have here, South Asians in the United States, is a guide for social workers and other professionals dealing with a variety of social problems as affecting South Asians in the United States. In her first two chapters, Dr. Bhandari observes that there's 5.5 million South Asians living in the U.S. with origins in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and Bhutan. I thought that we could begin, Dr. Bhandari, if you don't mind, giving us some background on the immigration from South Asia. In your book you describe 3 different periods, and I thought maybe you could summarize for us what those periods looked like and what effect they had both on immigrants and on the United States.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me. Yeah, there were different patterns of immigration, and they varied with the kind of people who came from South Asia to the United States. So one of them was in the 1800s or so, and then those were mainly farmers or laborers who came here to the United States. And then there was almost till 1924, and after that for about 40 years or so, there was almost a halt in immigration because of the way the immigration acts were passed in this country. And then finally in 1965, with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 is what opened doors to a lot of Asians, and specifically South Asians, to come to this country. And it was at that time that people came to this country to, they were mainly professionals, so they came here to further their education, who were doctors, lawyers, scientists, and engineers, and so on and so forth. And so that was one group that came here.
What's the possibility for 1965 being the year where the U.S., was there a need for more engineers or doctors at that time? Is that what prompted the change, or?
Yeah, I mean, and it was not just for South Asia, right? It's when United States decided to open doors for immigration, and it's just that countries of South Asia started taking advantage of that.
And they also opened doors primarily to skilled professionals as opposed to opening their doors to anybody from South Asia. You would have to have a degree, or you have to have some.
Yeah. And I think the investment in the graduate education probably started at that time. Investment in the university started at that time. So people could come here, get an education almost, free of cost, and become the skilled labor for the country. And so all of those things had a role to play. It's just that people from the Indian subcontinent were able to take advantage of it at that time.
One of the things that comes from that, especially since 2000, probably earlier, was there's this, I guess you would call it a myth, that South Asians, Japanese, other Asians are a model minority because look, they worked hard, they were successful, this is what a minority should do, which, is that a myth, or does that have some real reality to it?
So the term model minority is heavily loaded, and it is a myth, and I will explain, and I think I've explained it in my book, why it is a myth. So, and we need to look at the immigration patterns. So in 1965, what was happening in the United States at that time? So 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. And so when the South Asians started coming after a halt of about 40 years, they didn't have the need, or they were, first of all, they were a very different group. They were a group of professionals. They didn't have the need to express solidarity with the African Americans or with the civil rights movement.
And they already had education, and they already had resources to get here. So.
Exactly. It was a group of people who were cherry-picked from their country, the best of the best, who were coming here to further their education, to further their skill set.
Well, it's certainly only part of the experience, but I wonder, because you say the oppression and the exploitation of blacks and Latinos in the United States is not the experience that Indians in particular had. On the other hand, the history of colonialism, there probably was those
Yeah.
conditions of gross inequality
Yeah.
and physical violence and the rest through the British colonization. So
Yeah.
it's like, that's probably ancient history for people that are coming in the 2000s, because they would have, that would have been 1980 when they were born or something. So they may not have a recollection of that. On the other hand, it seems like there still is this understanding or recognition of the colonial past in the entire region. So.
And there is, and that colonialism has an impact on everything that we do, right? There are different chapters in the book, right from the LGBT chapter or the chapter on mental health. And those chapters talk about what role colonialism has had on these issues. So if you look at, even if you look at LGBT, for example, the Hindu scriptures have a lot of mention and acknowledgement of same-sex relationships or people of the third gender and so on and so forth. But it was under the colonists, the Britishers, that laws were passed where, same-sex relationships were not accepted, and that has a role to play in today's world where, the entire society has turned against these issues. So even if, you look at the chapter on mental health, how colonialism has a role to play in how we view mental health. And so all of those things are explained in the post-colonial world.
This may be a slight diversion, and if we don't want to go there, just say so, but I wonder to what extent you're talking about how colonialism misappropriated and shut down the traditions of Hinduism and the traditional cultures. At the same time, it strikes me that the British took very much advantage of the caste system and kind of overlaid it with a social class, but the caste system allowed the British to maintain control because of the very caste system. And I ask that because I don't think most viewers will know what caste is, and maybe you can give a quick summary of the. I realize this is maybe off topic, but a quick summary of the origins of it and the effects today of it.
Right. So the caste system, even though it's very similar, the closest caste system can be explained to people in the West would be race. So with racism, people can, it exists. It's similar with casteism. The difference being that you would know the caste of a person by their last name. And the way it exists, so the caste system,
The caste system doesn't necessarily, in the United States, race is a construction, it's socially constructed.
And similarly is caste.
But in the United States, in many cases, you can tell somebody's in a race by their skin color. But my understanding is the caste system doesn't necessarily have an equivalent. Like if you're Dalit, you don't necessarily are darker than somebody in a higher caste, and some people in the higher caste also may have dark skin because of their, so it's like, it's not quite as apparent, but if you're saying it's by the last name, you immediately know the caste of somebody. And that's going to affect marriage, that's going to affect education, that's going to affect access to, I would assume, many other things.
Right. So the way the system, absolutely right. So the color of the skin may not have a role, but your last name will have a role. And the way it works is that the upper caste are the Brahmins. And when the caste system was prevalent, you could not switch, and you still cannot make a switch. So if you are born in lower caste, you do the occupation of that caste. So the upper caste is the Brahmins or the teachers or the priests, so to speak. The second level is the Kshatriyas, who are the warriors. The third level were the businessmen or the Vaishyas. The fourth level were called the Shudras, and they would do, the menial jobs and so on and so forth. And then the Dalits were the one who were so-called untouchables. And it was more so like a division of labor, but just like you said, like race is a social construction, caste was a social construction. And it came into being to basically, dominate the ones who are of a lower caste. What happened because of this is that marriages, you could not marry somebody outside of your caste. even though it has been outlawed, caste system has been outlawed on paper.
It still has a social practice.
It is still looked down upon if you get married to somebody of a different caste. So an extreme effect of an intercaste marriage could be honor killing. That would be an extreme effect. And a low level effect of that could be just being disowned from your family, you know. So all of those things. So they have a role to play when, especially in social occasions, especially in marriages, and so on and so forth. Even though, and India is one of the, I think India is the country that has the highest population of Hindus, but then wherever they go, they take the caste system with them.
Including to the United States.
Yeah.
Because I read recently that there was a Dalit, an untouchable woman that was a scholar, that was invited to Google to speak about the caste system. And then several people at Google complained because they thought it was anti-Indian. And she appealed to Panjai, the head of Google, and she was disinvited essentially. So it's not like when you talk about bringing something from your colonial past or your social structure, here it seems like that also has followed people, which I would imagine adds to the stress, because if you think you're now in a new country under new rules, new expectations, but this condition remains where you can't interact or you can't marry or you can't perform a certain job, that would seem to create mental health problems as well. So, one of the things that struck me about the book is you spend some time talking about intersectionality theory. I know very few things about South Asia, but I do understand there's like well over 300 languages. I study media, so I realize that TV productions, movie productions are done in different languages, Telugu, Punjab, Hindi. So that suggests that you may be from India, but if you're speaking Malayalam or Punjab, it's not the same as if you're speaking Hindi, even though the caste system may be throughout. So when you talk about intersectionality, this raises these questions of not only caste or social class or occupation, but also these different, I don't know if you call them nationalities or sub-nationalities within the larger society that would need to be understood if you're going to do social work or you're going to do some psychological counseling. Not understanding this could create some problems.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that is the reason I utilized intersectionality to explain these identities, and to explain that, you know, the religion is another piece, religion, language, the part of the country that you come from, the color of your skin, all of these things will matter. So there are a lot of these factors or intersections that you need to understand. So let me back up a little bit. The term intersectionality came into the literature from Kimberly Crenshaw, and she used it, you know, to explain it for African American women especially. However, I have adapted that to South Asians and explained that how all the things that I mentioned, like your religion, your language, and your social identity, have a role to play in who you are and what can be dominant over the other, or the class that you belong to, or the caste that you belong to. All of those things will have a role to play. When you talk about these different languages, a lot of people from South Asia may not identify as South Asians. They may identify as the term Desi, that's one. Or they may identify as, you know, Punjabi or as Marwadi or as Gujarati. That's how they may identify themselves, because every state has its own.
That's a different culture.
It's a different culture. The food, the language, all of that is different. And they are not nationalities, they would be states. So every state, every state has its own language, and it is a language, it's not a dialect. So it will have its own language, and it would have its own, you know, the food and, you know, holidays and so on and so forth. So if you live in that state, you will learn the language of the state. And then some states have Hindi also, and then they learn, you know,
English.
because of the colonists, English was a given. I mean, a lot of schools
And cricket.
are English. Yes,
Sorry.
cricket. Yeah, that's a national game, so to speak. So,
So when somebody comes to the United States and they say, "Oh, you're in the U.S. now, forget about where you came from," it's just one, it's not possible, but two, it kind of obscures and disguises all of these intersectional
Right.
identities that any
Exactly.
individual person could have,
Right.
which is going to, I think, would contribute to your mental health or detract from your mental health
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
other things. You talk in here about structural intersectionality and political intersectionality that talks about how there's a difference between what social class you're in and how you might be seen on the street. And you
Right.
talk about hate crimes because oftentimes I know Sikhs have been attacked for being
Yeah.
Arabic
Yeah.
because they had a turban on. So, but all of that seems to be underwritten by skin color or color as something that is constructed that has certain meaning.
Yeah.
So you use the word colorism in a few
Right.
places. So if we were to talk about colorism as separate from caste, as separate from social class, as separate from gender, how would we begin to understand colorism?
So colorism means preference for the lighter skin tone. And we don't know how it started in South Asia, but what we know is it's widely acceptable in South Asia. So we don't know if it was the colonists because of that it started, or was it because of the Mughal rule that
It probably was
before.
reinforced by the colonists.
It was
Yes.
definitely reinforced by the colonists,
Yes.
or we don't know. Like there are mentions in the Hindu scriptures which are thousands of years old. There is mention of colorism, like goddess Parvati was dark-skinned and she had to get a boon to become fair-skinned to impress Lord Shiva. So there are those scriptures that have it, but again, we don't know how it started and when it started.
Yeah.
What we do know is that there is such high preference for lighter skin tone that there is this multi-billion-dollar beauty industry that sells you fair skin.
Yeah.
That tells
That was
you
true in the black community in the United States. Johnson was one of the major manufacturers and they sold skin cream.
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely. So we have this Fair and Lovely cream, and there has been a lot of outrage now, and there's a lot of campaigns against it, but it's still widely acceptable, and you can see that, in terms of the matrimonial advertisements that are put out. You want a fair and beautiful wife, and that in itself explains to you.
You point out that many South Asians live in the United States, but they have close connections back home, which may mean that they're privileged in one locale and a success story, but they seem to be disadvantaged in another locale, like in the United States. So you go back and forth from privilege to marginalization. So in this sense, does that help? Does intersectionality help with that understanding, or does it reflect or demonstrate that understanding?
It helps to understand this. The reason being, it's important. Intersectionality is, as a tool is important because at times you are marginalized when you are away from your family, or you do not have the social support system, or your immigration status doesn't let you work. There is a chapter that talks about barriers to work, and that disproportionately affects women because usually women come as spouses in this country, and because of their immigration
And
status,
they can't even work. Yeah.
they cannot work, even though laws have changed now for the better. So intersectionality helps you explain that and to understand that there could be some things that could work in your favor and some things that could work against you. And it is important to look at it from that context. So when you're dealing with somebody who's abused, but if they are a doctor versus somebody who's undocumented, versus somebody who's on a dependent immigration status, you have to look
It's going to affect how they respond to the violence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how they can be best helped.
Yeah. One of the things, again, this may be slightly off base, but India is presented as the largest democracy in the world. And I also understand it, not in addition to caste, they have social class. Recently I read that less than 1% of the population, about 130 billionaires, have 40% of the wealth, but the rest of the population, 50% of the population, has about 3% of the wealth, which is, it sounds a lot like the U.S. divisions
Right.
between rich and poor, but I just wonder if there's a relationship between who owns the production, who owns the corporations, who controls the labor, and its effect on immigration to this country.
Yeah, that it's affected by that. It's also affected politically about what kind of government the United States would have and how friendly it is with
Modi. Yeah.
you know, with the Modi government currently. One would be that piece. The other would be how much does the government here wants to appease the people here, because we rarely hear news about H-1B visa or about the long waiting line for the South Asian people to get a green card. We rarely hear about those things.
Yeah.
We hear about the 13 million undocumented workers, right? So a lot depends. I think it's also about the political climate, which government is more friendly, which government wants to appease its own people.
And what else is going on in the world, like the Ukraine war probably has some effect on how the U.S. relates to India at the particular moment, or Pakistan for that matter.
Right.
One of the things, again, we probably won't have time to talk about all the chapters in the book, but one of them that struck me particularly interesting was domestic violence against women in South Asian communities. You show that 40% of the women said that they were positive currently experiencing domestic violence. In the U.S. as a whole, 70% of domestic violence is unreported, but even with that reporting, it only reaches about 25%, so this is a dramatic difference. And you mentioned before about how your background, your class, your caste, your visa status may affect on how you would even consider talking about it. The other thing that you said is there's a certain expectation given the hierarchy in India that you don't necessarily see the therapist as a therapist, but more as an advisor. And I didn't understand exactly what you were meaning for that. And it obviously has to do with social work and psychology, but what do you mean that if you're my therapist, I want you to advise me, but what do you see as the difference?
Right. So that goes back to the cultural values that South Asians have, and that is in complete contrast with the Western values. South Asians believe in collectivism, interdependence, social support, so on and so forth. However, the Western world or the Western values are around individualism, independence, and so when people from South Asia come to this country, they are used to being told what to do. They're not being given recommendations, but they're used to. So when they go to a therapist or when they go to a healthcare professional, they look for advice, and they get.
Tell me what to do, not let me talk to you.
Yeah. So that is one big piece of the puzzle where they get very confused. It's like the doctor is asking me if I can do this, and it's like, if you're the doctor, you're supposed to tell me what to do, Also, doctors, therapists are looked as more of people of expertise and authoritarian figures, and they are expected to tell you, what is right for you and follow up if you're not doing things, which is not the way the system works here. So it takes a while for people to get used to the system here, and the professionals to understand that if your client is sitting there and explaining to you all about their culture, then it's a waste of their time too. I actually have my own.
It probably helps to have a person of the same cultural background, maybe not exclusively, but at least in big sections where they can intertwine, so they're starting on a higher level, or starting to be able to deal with whatever the problem happens to be, rather than creating this whole cultural, historical background.
Exactly, where you have to explain. So I have my own mental health practice, and I see clients, and most of my clients are South Asians, and they come and tell me that my earlier therapist, I had to just explain to them, and I had spent most time educating them about what's going on, versus wanting to know what I can do about it. So that's the reason that this book is here, for people who are in helping professionals, not just mental health, but doctors or physical therapists or anybody, to understand these things and have this context and know in advance.
I apologize for not being ready to talk about mental health, domestic violence, and other issues that you raise in your book, but we spend a lot of time talking about immigration and the conditions that make possible this. So I would encourage people to get your book, South Asians in the United States, because it doesn't just apply, in my mind, just apply to social workers or other health professions. So I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have on the program. I want to thank Dr. Shreya Bhandari for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. We'll see you next time.